Hello, fellow humans. In many of my videos, I have been proposing a specific definition of capitalism that looks at the fundamental forces that cause the behavior of capitalist corporations. This is going to be the subject of my research over the next couple of years because I intend to get a PhD studying these forces. I think that looking at capitalism from this perspective adds a lot of clarity and understanding about what capitalism is and what we can do to create a different economic system that works much better. I do not see the market system or the private ownership of the means of production or working for a wage as being the fundamental causal forces that drive capitalism. Sure, these three elements can very well define capitalism, but in reality, they are just symptoms of something happening at the more fundamental level, which are the forces that I have been talking about: proportionality, dispossession, hierarchies, and growth. I'll try to explain in very simple terms over a couple of videos what would it look like if we replaced these forces with something else. I will not spend time explaining how these forces were created because that would require much more time, and I will do this properly in my future research. I will focus in this series on imagining a very real future that could very well happen very soon if we decided to undo these causal forces inside capitalism. In this video, I will start with the first relationship that links power to property. This is what I call the force or the doctrine of proportionality. Basically, proportionality is about the idea that the more property you have, the more power you have in proportion. Sometimes it is just linear proportion. Sometimes it is exponential proportion. The opposite is also valid. The more social and political power you have, the more chances you have to have more property or wealth, if you want to call it like that, in proportion to the size of power. Since I'm not going into the details now, why is it like that? We'll just imagine an economy without the doctrine of proportionality by using a specific example: the stock market. The stock market is the perfect instance of proportionality, but there are others. The stock market is the place where shares of companies are traded and where investors are supposed to invest money into companies in what is called a secondary market. But why is it like that? Why do companies have shares? Why are they tradable in the first place? When a company issues shares, they usually, but not always, give their owner the power to vote at the meetings of shareholders on selecting the board of directors, for example. The proportionality is simple. One share gives you one vote. If you have 10 million shares, you get 10 million votes. Undoing the system means phasing out the stock market and phasing out the principle of one share, one vote. I propose one way to do it is with public trusts. A public trust would be a public institution that is owned in common by all citizens of the country. It is not owned by the state, as for example, a sovereign fund, like the Alaska Sovereign Fund that pays dividends to the people of Alaska for what the state receives as income from fossil fuel exploitation, or the Government Pension Fund of Norway, also known as the Norwegian Sovereign Fund, that has almost $2 trillion in assets and is owned by the government of Norway. The public trust would be managed by citizens directly, selected not through elections, but through qualified lotteries, meaning people will be selected at random, then go through training in order to serve on the public trust. Once selected, they can consult experts in finance and economics to make informed decisions. So how will the public trust replace the stock market? At first, rich people, instead of paying taxes in cash, they will pay taxes in stocks. A percentage of their stock portfolio will be transferred each year into the public trust, Gradually, this will make the public trust owner in many of the companies listed on the stock market. I call this wealth tax in kind. Second, many stocks are owned by investment funds, pension funds, and all sorts of shell companies. The massive problem of this is the many layers of ownership between these entities. Often they own stocks in each other. They also buy and sell huge amounts of stocks at very high speeds. Trillions of dollars worth of stock change hands every day on stock markets around the world. There's also the massive problem with speculation and over leverage. This means institutions can buy stock by not using their own money and by using instead loans with or without collateral. In many situations, the collateral is the stock itself that they are buying. This is insane. The deregulation of the financial sector has allowed investors to buy stock 10 times, 20 times more than the size of their collateral, if collateral exists in the first place. This is possible because they are not required to close their positions right away, meaning they don't have to pay with cash immediately what they bought. They are allowed to keep their positions open for days or even longer. This is insane. Regular people like you or me are not allowed to do that. Since we have this complicated web of ownership where pension funds are also invested, it is tricky to undo the system without affecting the life savings of people. But there is a way to do it. What really matters here is not how much stock a pension fund has in another company, but the value of each individual pension for each real person. We have to preserve the value of that pension. Since a pension fund has an obligation to pay pensions to you and me when we retire from active employment, that obligation will be transferred to the public trust. When pensions became a matter of private investment, they were also exposed to the risks that came from the stock market. Many people lost their life savings in the 2008 financial crash because those pensions were not guaranteed. They were invested in stocks through greedy and irresponsible brokers and financial managers. This massive scam is called a defined contribution pension. This means you will get back in pension whatever you put in yourself and some contributions from your employer. And if you are lucky that the market goes well, you will get the money back plus some additional value. But the risk is on you. You can also lose everything. The much better system is a defined benefit pension, which guarantees you a minimum amount of pension for the rest of your life, regardless of the performance of the market. You still have to put money into a defined benefit pension, but at least you will get it back guaranteed for the rest of your life. Once investment funds and pension funds complete the transfer of their ownership of stock into the public trust, along with the obligation to maintain the value of accumulated savings for the working families, then the stock market will become obsolete because there will be nothing left to trade on the stock market. Proportionality will be simply phased out. Does this mean that all companies that were listed on the stock market will be now owned by the people through the public trust? Yes, to a large extent, but not completely. Companies may choose to convert themselves from a shareholder type company into various kinds of cooperatives or social benefit companies where ownership and power are not linked in proportion. Instead of the one share, one vote doctrine, they can choose one worker, one vote principles. This conversion can be done in several ways. One way is to separate ownership from power first without any transfer of stock. Shareholders will simply lose the vote, which will be transferred to the employees. The company will become a democratic institution. Workers will select their managers and decide what kind of power to give them and for how long. Workers do not have to decide on everything. Companies can easily have departments that are ran democratically, where employees decide what happens in that department. Decisions that interest the company as a whole will be made democratically by all employees. Another way is for employees to simply buy out the former shareholders by using loans from the public trust. In this way, the public trust can also act as a form of public banking system. These loans can be paid back in time at zero interest from the revenue made by the company. Companies like Amazon, Meta, Apple, Google are enormous companies with thousands of owners and market valuations in the trillions of dollars. They have hundreds of thousands of employees that would not be able to take such huge loans. These companies would need to be socialized by transferring ownership to the public trust and transferring power to the employees, but also to the general public. Many companies can be considered as serving social needs, such as communication, energy production, or utilities, so their operations should be fully democratized by transferring power to the general public. If big tech companies are declared utilities, we can begin this process of socialization, which includes the transfer of ownership into the public trust and the transfer of power to the employees and the public. People making important decisions in these companies should be selected by qualified lottery, as I have mentioned, with full transparency for the entire mandate, including procedures to recall selected representatives. This is what economic democracy would look like. One crucial aspect of these transfers of ownership is that they need to come in a package with some other policies that address the massive problem with wealth and income inequality. What do we do, for example, with CEOs and executives that have savings in pensions worth millions and tens of millions? Is it fair to allow them to keep all of that? What do we do with the wealth that is not stored in stocks or cash, but in real estate, expensive cars, art, yachts, jet planes? Sure, we may transfer all stock owned by the super rich into the public trust, but hard assets cannot be transferred that easily. A different mechanism is needed for these assets, which involves different kinds of flat out expropriation, in the case of private jets, for example, or mega mansions, or a fair evaluation of their value at market prices by independent auditors, and a wealth tax that would reduce the total amount of wealth owned by the super rich. Of course, if the super rich cannot pay the wealth tax, they can sell the asset to the public. The idea is, who is going to buy a mega mansion? Another billionaire? Of course not, because we want to phase them all out. In this case, common asset trusts can do the job. They will be sisters of the public trust that can take over the ownership of hard assets owned by the super rich. Common asset trusts can borrow money from the public trust or be financed directly by the central bank at zero interest. They will also need to be managed democratically, allowing the local community to decide the purpose of these assets, such as the mega estates. Needless to say, private jets would need to be all grounded and disassembled because of the massive environmental damage they do. We need all that metal and wires to make bicycles. Same goes for cruise ships. This entire process can be done over the span of several years with some significant changes in legislation. It is not something utopic. It will have a significant effect on how the economy is organized for sure, but it will be a massive improvement in the stability of wealth for the working class. It will also disconnect power from property by phasing out the ability of the super rich to buy politicians and influence our public life. The super rich already have too much power, and many are working hard at dismantling democracy altogether. So the way to stop them is to disconnect power from property which is represented by the doctrine of proportionality. This is, in a nutshell, the core idea of how we can phase out the doctrine of proportionality. Of course, there are many details that need to be fleshed out. I would love to read your reactions so we can talk more about how we can undo capitalism in future videos. I will do an episode on each of the other forces, so stick around. Share this with your friends and let us stay focused on what really drives capitalism so we can finally get rid of this undemocratic system. Thank you for watching and for supporting me on Patreon. Your help keeps my lights on and my hope up. Only together we can defeat capitalism and make the world a better place. Increase the peace.